Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
The nights are growing colder, the shadows longer, and something sinister stirs in the air. If you've ever wondered why we carve pumpkins, dress up in costumes, or crave a good ghost story this time of year, you're in for a treat, or maybe a trick. Tonight, we're joined by a true Halloween aficionado, Lisa Morton. She's a true expert on all things spooky, a master of horror storytelling, and a historian who's traced Halloween's origins from ancient rituals to today's haunted celebrations.
From the spooky origins of the holiday to the creepiest traditions you never knew existed, Lisa's here to help us unravel the mysteries of Halloween. So, as the gusts of the chilly autumn wind rap at your windows and tap at your doors, let's conjure up some frightful fun and uncover the stories behind the spookiest of seasons with Lisa. Hey, Lisa, welcome to the show. How's it going on this October night?
I'm good. I'm actually awake, which is a good thing.
Definitely glad to have you with us. I know you're an author, screenwriter, and editor known for, a lot of work in the horror genre. And you've also done non-fiction-y stuff as well. And you've won numerous awards, been nominated for awards, and you're an expert on Halloween and paranormal history. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself besides what I've just said?
That was a pretty good introduction, actually. I am a lifelong resident of Southern California in LA. I started as a screenwriter. That was actually what I studied in college. I didn't realize until I had a few really bad films made from my screenplays that was not for me. And so back around the early 90s was when I kind of made the transition from screenwriting to writing stories and books. And it was the smartest thing I ever did because that was where I found my home. And I have now written, as you mentioned, 3 different books on the history of Halloween and 3 books on various paranormal subjects.
With all of this, different kinds of writing that you've done, how did you get into writing? How did you get into the horror genre?
I always loved to write. I was an only child, and I think it was how I kind of kept myself entertained. My family also moved a lot because of my dad's work. So, when you're an only kid and you're getting moved every 6 months to a new place, you tend to come up with ways to keep yourself entertained, and writing was my way of doing that. And I had my first piece published when I was 5. It was a poem about my pet turtle. My first short story was published when I was 14. It was a romantic comedy of all things. When I was 15, I saw this little movie called The Exorcist. That movie completely changed my life because it's hard now in 2024 to explain how that movie affected people in 1974 or 73 when it was first released. I mean, that thing absolutely blew audiences out of their seats. And watching that during its initial release with a bunch of a sold out audience made me say, well, you know what? I kind of want to do this for my life. So that was when I changed my major from anthropology to film. My counselors and parents were all horrified. And I just kind of always loved horror just because of the intense emotions that come along with it.
That's amazing. Anthropology to writing that's a bit of a change. And I think it's kind of cool that The Exorcist is the film that pushed you in that direction. At the time, people freaked out in theaters when that was released. Like I said, you've written fiction, nonfiction. What do you enjoy writing the most?
Probably short stories.
Okay.
I love the short story form. I actually think it's the best form for horror. Whenever people ask me to name like my favorite horror books, I always say to them, can I name short stories instead? Because I feel like those are the things I most remember within the horror genre, the things that have left me really unsettled, because it's hard to keep up that gigantic emotional response, I think, through 300 pages. Horror works so well for me in that little short burst. I love reading and writing both the short story for horror.
That's interesting because we were talking to somebody yesterday, and we talked a lot about, whether it's long format or short stories, or kind of settled on like discussing short stories, especially when it comes to things that are on the darker side of things. It's the right amount of pages. It's like just enough to scare you a little bit and not go overboard.
How have you seen the horror genre or the spooky subject matter kind of evolve over time since you've been exposed to it for so long?
It has definitely shifted. When I was first kind of really thinking about writing horror, it was the 80s. And the 80s was a massive horror boom. And the problem with a massive boom is that it also means that publishers are buying everything and publishing it, and some of it is not good. And it glutted the market with a lot of bad stuff. And so by the 90s, people were saying, well, horror is dead. And we all knew, of course, that that was ridiculous. It was just cyclical, as most genres are. And I am so thrilled with where it's at right now. I love all of the new writers that we are seeing. We're seeing, I mean, when I was starting off in the 90s, there were so few women writing in the genre, or at least getting published in the genre, I should say. And now there are so many. You open up any anthology or magazine, and half the names are women, and half the names are people of color and LGBTQ writers. And I just love that new diversity, and it's bringing us such great material. And the genre is, I think it's in kind of a golden age right now myself.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. There's a lot coming out right now, because when I was a kid, I'd read a lot of horror and a lot of short stories for horror. So I still have some of those like anthology books of all those stories. And I was talking to Chandi the other day, and I was like, I need to revisit those. Like as an adult, read them again and just kind of go through them, and then also read new things that are out there as well, because there's a lot out there. So we're here to talk about Halloween in depth. We know that you're an expert on Halloween and paranormal. So what are the early origins of Halloween?
Well, there are kind of two camps of thinking among Halloween scholars. And yes, there really are Halloween scholars. And one camp believes that the history of the holiday derives almost completely from the Catholic All Saints' Day. The other camp, which is the one that I fall into, believes that it comes much more from an ancient Irish Celtic holiday called Samhain, which looks, by the way, like it should be pronounced Samhain. And that's why there are so many horror movies and stories that have characters named Sam Hain in them. It is spelled Samhain, but pronounced Samhain. And Samhain was a New Year's celebration for the ancient Irish Celts. It was that time when the days were getting shorter, the weather was getting colder, they were hunkering down for a long, very cold winter. And as their New Year's festival, a time between years, they thought other borders were down on that night too. It was a night when the veil between our world and something called the other world was at its thinnest. And the other world was like another dimension where these really malicious things called the She lived. The She might cross over into our world on Samhain and do terrible things. They could bring a corpse to life. They would burn down a palace. They might kidnap unwary humans and take them back to the other world, where, by the way, time moved differently. And I think that sort of macabre side of Samhain, which, by the way, was celebrated with a long feast that lasted 3 days, I think all of that gives us this sort of personality that we associate now with Halloween. I don't see a lot of spooky stuff out of a celebration of Catholic saints. I know some of the saints were pretty freaky, walking around with their heads under their arm, that kind of thing. But that's not really the character of saints overall. And I think Halloween's macabre side definitely comes from Samhain.
And so it's always kind of had this not darkness, but just sort of this, not like a happy, pleasant holiday celebration.
Well, there is that, but I also see a little bit of whimsy and magic in it. And again, I think that kind of derives from Samhain, which was a feasting time for the Celts. And by the way, we don't know extensive history of exactly what they would have done at Samhain because the Celts didn't record any of their own history. What we know about them is either from archaeological evidence or what the Catholic missionaries recorded about them when they moved into Ireland to try and convert them. So, what we have are mostly these accounts that were transcribed by these missionaries that tell us that they had these 3-day feast and that they were telling these spooky stories to each other. And there is a little bit of archaeological evidence that corroborates all of that. To me, it definitely gets a little bit of almost even a party flavor from what the Celts were doing with the long feast and the telling the stories. And there are, I think, are also some records of them maybe doing sporting events as part of their Samhain celebration.
How did those traditions translate into the United States and into American culture?
After the Celts were kind of Christianized, which took about 1,000 years, mainly this was the Irish and Scottish people. Over in actual England, Samhain and Halloween never really caught on because in the 17th century, the British Parliament banned all Catholic holidays. They were trying to separate themselves from the church. And so among the holidays that were banned was All Saints' Day and Halloween. So what we got was Halloween became very localized to just the Irish and Scottish people who were kind of carrying on these Celtic traditions. And when they came to America, mainly in the 19th century to escape famine, they brought these traditions with them, and they loved Halloween. The Irish in particular loved playing pranks. For the Scottish, the day was more about a party where they would play fortune-telling games. And so they're coming to America in the middle of the 19th century, mainly the 1840s, and there's something interesting happening in America at the time, which is new printing technologies that are putting magazines out there. Magazines are suddenly huge in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. There are a lot of them. All of these American housewives are reading these magazines that have names like Godey's Ladies Book and Harper's Monthly and so forth. And because these magazines need so much content, because there are so many of them, they love talking about these quaint regional celebrations that immigrants are bringing with them. And so these American housewives start reading these charming stories of this thing called Halloween. And they think, hey, that sounds fun. My kids would love that. So by about the 1860s or 70s, we start to see Halloween parties happening throughout America because it's now been taken up by American matrons from reading about it in these magazines. And so for about the next 30 years or so, Halloween is mainly a children's thing in America. They would celebrate by having a party that would usually start in the afternoon, and the young people would arrive at one house and they would do things like make candy. They were making these taffy, which required a lot of pulling, and so it became a group activity. And then in the evening, they would hunker down and they would hear some ghost stories, and it would be a little bit spooky, but a lot of fun for them. And that's kind of where it stays for the most of the 19th century. It isn't until the end of the 19th century that we start to see adults now also celebrating.
It's interesting to see that timeline and also see how Halloween has evolved in the US. How did Halloween change into its current form in the US?
By about 1900, one of the things that was happening in Halloween was that boys were playing pranks. They had kind of taken this up from the Irish. And at first, the pranks were kind of fun and innocent. The boys might go out to a farmhouse, for example, and tip over an outhouse or soap the window. Or I even just read the other day about one where they let all of the cows out of their fields and turn them loose in the middle of a town, that kind of thing. In some areas, the pranks got more elaborate. They would do things like disassemble a buggy and reassemble it on a roof or in the main street of town. And there were areas where they would do this with gates, so much that they actually started to call Halloween Gate Night. And you can see vintage postcards from about 1910 where they will be labeled Gate Night, and it's a reference to Halloween. This, like I said, started off being kind of rural and fun and innocent, but as America became more urbanized in the beginning of the 20th century and the cities were growing, these pranks were moving into cities. And when they moved into cities, they started to become less about playing pranks and more about vandalism. And the kids were lighting fires and breaking light fixtures and even tripping people on sidewalks. And it was costing cities millions of dollars of damage. By the time you get into the late 20s and the 30s, you're in the middle of the Great Depression. So now it's difficult to be able to find the money to repair all of this damage. And a lot of cities were thinking about just trying to ban Halloween at that point. In fact, 1933, a lot of newspapers referred to that year as Black Halloween because the damage was so severe and extensive that year. But fortunately, some of the cities came up with a much better idea, which was to try and buy these kids off. Some of the cities actually printed up little pamphlets and booklets that they gave out to homeowners that suggested parties and things they could provide for the kids, like very early primitive versions of haunted attractions. And because this was the Depression, very few homes could afford to do this on their own. So a bunch of homes would get together and they would do these things that were called house-to-house parties. And that ends up, by about the end of the 1930s, becoming trick or treat. And it was essentially the form that we would recognize, which was a bunch of costume kids would go to a house and they would say trick or treat, and the homeowners would give them treats in order to buy them off. It kind of goes on hold, though, in the 40s because of World War II. Sugar is hard to get, and people are just not in a partying mood. So it gets put on a little bit of hold in the 40s, but it comes back really strong when World War II ends. Now we get media representations of it. It's on the new sitcoms showing up on television. There's a big Disney cartoon that comes out called Trick or Treat. And then the other thing that happens in the 50s is retailing. Because up until the war ends, the mothers were making all of the treats. And so they were making popcorn balls and donuts and candy apples. And this was obviously extremely labor intensive. So when these candy companies come along in the 50s and they say, hey, Mom, you don't have to do that anymore. We're going to supply you with these candies. And obviously the kids like that too, because who doesn't want chocolate more than a candied apple? And then also we have costume companies coming in and saying, hey, guess what, kids? You don't have to be a pirate again because Mom's got some old clothing in the attic that works for that. How would you like to be Superman? Because these costume companies started licensing the most popular comic book and television characters. And of course, that took off. So by the mid-50s, you get a trick or treat that is extremely recognizable and is pretty much what we are still doing today.
And just to go back a bit, what does Halloween mean exactly?
That's a really good question, Zoe, because I think very few people know what it means. I always like to say the holiday that makes it so misunderstood. It's like everyone knows what Mother's Day means or New Year's or something, but Halloween actually is derived from a phrase that breaks down to All Hallows Evening. Hallow was an old name for saints. And back when All Saints' Day was trying to co-opt Samhain, they would start celebrating on the night before the actual holiday. So All Saints' Day, which is actually November 1st, would start being celebrated at sundown on October 31st, the evening before. So All Hallows means all of the saints. The E-E-N part used to be spelled, by the way, with an apostrophe between the two E's to indicate that the V had been left out. So that's where that all comes from.
Obviously celebrating Halloween for since I was a baby, but every year, there's the same sort of imagery that's kind of a part of it, right? I mean, we see witches, we see ghosts, we see monsters and vampires. And how do those elements get incorporated into the holiday?
I kind of think of the Halloween icons as being a big trio of the jack-o'-lantern, the witch, and the black cat. And they all got a huge boost from classic short stories in the 19th century. And it's interesting that these three short stories I'm going to mention, only one kind of obliquely even mentions Halloween. But these stories were told so much at parties that they became associated with these sort of avatars of Halloween. The first story is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, which of course gives us the whole idea of the jack-o'-lantern and being a spooky icon. The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. And the last one is Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which now is probably the least known of the three. It's a story about a young man who discovers that everybody in his village is a witch. But in the 19th century, it was a gigantically popular story that was told over and over and over. People loved telling it at Halloween. And those three stories kind of gave us, I think, those three Halloween icons. And the jack-o'-lantern in particular, which I think we can pretty much all agree is the king of Halloween icons. And that is something that is based on an old folk tale. There is a folktale that goes back centuries. There are hundreds of variations of it that centers on a character known as either Jack the Trickster or Stingy Jack or Mean Jack. In most versions of this folktale, Jack is a blacksmith who outwits the devil 3 times, keeps the devil from taking his soul. So when Jack finally dies, obviously heaven wants nothing to do with him, but he goes to hell and the devil says, well, I'm mad at you. I don't want you in here, but here, I'll toss you this burning hell ember and you can use that to light your way. And Jack puts this hell ember into a carved out gourd. And that becomes the lantern that he uses to wander forever in this sort of netherworld that he is stuck in. And so that image of a glowing carved out gourd is the jack-o'-lantern. The Irish were carving these out of turnips. They had big turnips in Ireland that they would use, and they loved to put these carved glowing faces out on Halloween night in some dark area where someone not expecting to come across something like that would get a little bit of fright and would recognize the face was supposed to be Jack's lantern. So when they came to America and saw these gorgeous, gigantic orange pumpkins that were native to the New World, they, of course, exchanged their turnips for those pumpkins and started carving jack-o'-lanterns out of those pumpkins. And by the end of the 19th century, it's interesting that you can see party guides. I have one from 1897 that talks about setting up a Halloween party with jack-o'-lanterns, but it talks about carving them out of things like apples and cucumbers. Don't ask me how that's possible. I don't get that myself. But by the beginning of the 20th century, you really see the pumpkin is taking over. You can see it in early Halloween catalogs and in these vintage postcards that were so popular at the time.
That's probably where you get the orange and black theme for Halloween, and black for the black cat, orange for the pumpkin.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I'd never really heard of Young Goodman Brown. Might have to actually read that one.
It's a very entertaining story. It's a very dark satire, really. It's about this young man in a puritanical community who is making his way through a dark forest. And the oblique reference to Halloween is something like that one night of the year, it says. It doesn't even say it was October 31st or Halloween. But and then he stumbles on this massive conclave of witches out in the forest. And it's actually very witty and very darkly funny at moments.
So, not everyone has a positive view of Halloween. Where do the negative views of Halloween come from?
I'm really glad you asked that. It's interesting that there is a specific point in history we can trace that to. That is so seldom the case in these kind of things, but in this situation, there absolutely is. We can trace this back to the 18th century. There was a gentleman named Charles Vallancey who was a surveyor, and he was living in Ireland, and the British government assigned him to create maps of Ireland. And Vallancey was absolutely obsessed with Celtic lore, the ancient Celts, their language, their history, even their arts and so forth. And he ended up, while he was working on these maps, also creating a 6-volume collection of Celtic lore. It is massive, and he published that in 1786, and there's just one problem with this. Vallancey was a terrible historian. He was completely denounced by every other historian at the time. They would say things like, if you want to laugh, read a little of Vallancey. If you want to sleep, read a lot. And one of the things that Charles Vallancey decided, he threw out everything that people understood about Samhain, which was long established and accepted. The name, for example, actually means summer's end. He decided instead that it was some reference to an ancient Indian deity, which has a slightly similar name, and that, again, just for no apparent reason, decides this deity was a lord of death. And we get this incredibly convoluted chain of reasoning. If you try to read it, it will indeed just sort of boggle your brain because it makes no sense. But he is the one who says the Celts worshipped a lord of death called Samhain. And even though he was completely wrong and just made all of this up out of thin air, his books were on shelves in libraries all over the world and in private collections. And people were drawing from those books for their histories. There is a book that came out in the middle of the 20th century called Halloween Through 20 Centuries by a couple named Ralph and Adele Linton. And it was the only history of Halloween published for almost 50 years. And that history draws on Vallancey, and they also, I think, had a little bit of their own axe to grind. And concluding at the end of this book, I think they call Halloween something like a degraded or depraved holiday or something like that. And they kind of conclude their book saying, well, it's dying. Again, we have this book sitting on shelves and being the only history of Halloween that was probably available for a very long time throughout much of the world. So between Vallancey and the Lintons, we get this, what I call this strange alternate history of Halloween, which is unfortunately not true. But I can see when I look at, for example, at a lot of the modern things, usually like Christian fundamentalist pamphlets or booklets that denounce Halloween, they are always pulling from the old Vallancey and the Linton books. And it's kind of unfortunate, that is the mistaken history that they're pulling from.
Yeah, I mean, most people I know are totally cool with Halloween, but I've met a few people over the years that more religious and do have kind of a negative view of Halloween, which is unfortunate because it's a fun holiday for everybody.
And it also makes me laugh when I read, and I actually just read one of these last week when I read, well, Halloween has absolutely no Christian basis or background at all. And it's like, you don't even know what the name means, do you?
I guess another question I have is, we talked about how Halloween was ported over to the U.S. Is there anywhere in the U.S. that Halloween developed more so or developed first? Or was it just kind of like all over, sprinkled all over?
Well, it kind of spreads throughout the country in some interesting ways. The phrase, for example, trick or treat, probably came from Canada. The first mention I have been able to find of that phrase existing comes from Canada, and I think it's 1927. And it is not exactly our trick or treat. It was something that kids who were not even in costumes were saying to homeowners and having a very literal meaning at that point. You give us a trick or a treat or we're going to play a trick. And it does make me laugh, by the way, that most kids today have absolutely no idea why they are saying that. Yeah. I know I didn't even as a kid back when I was trick-or-treating. And so it kind of comes down in a couple of ways from Canada. There's one path I traced where it came down on the west side of America. You could see it you can follow the newspaper article timeline and see it kind of coming down through Washington and Oregon and into California. But on the other side of the country, it's also spreading down in the middle of the country and on the East Coast. And it just is kind of coming down at the same time in all of these different areas. And I think newspapers are certainly helping to spread that as well.
And on that note, what are any other leftover elements from the older Halloween tradition that we see nowadays, if any?
I always say one of these years I'm going to hold a traditional 18th century Halloween party. It sounds so fun. There isn't a lot of that has remained associated with the holiday, at least not in America. In the 18th century, for example, a traditional Scottish Halloween party was all about young people gathering and playing these fortune-telling games. And one of the big concerns for a young person in 1785, when Robert Burns wrote a really great poem called Halloween, was who they were going to marry. That was first and foremost in your life, especially, unfortunately, if you were a woman at the time. And a lot of these games were designed to reveal who you might end up marrying and how your marriage was going to go. And so they would be things like you would set a bunch of bowls out on the floor and you would blindfold someone and you would spin them around a couple of times and then they would have to go touch one of these bowls, and each bowl held something different. So if you, for example, touched the bowl that had clear water in it, it meant that everything was going to go well. You were going to have a great life. If you touched the bowl that had a thimble in it, that might mean, oh, you're going to be a spinster. So a lot of these games were these kind of things. Another popular one was taking a series of nuts, and you would name the nuts for each potential suitor or possible spouse, and you would set these up before the fire at the hearth, and depending on which nut cracked first and how it cracked, and would indicate who you might end up marrying. So these parties back then were all about the young people playing these games and drinking and dancing, and they had some very particular foods that they would eat, and they actually sound really fun. And we don't do much of that nowadays, actually, probably for better for the most part, but I think that party element certainly has come down without maybe some of those specifics. They were telling ghost stories. And, that certainly has come down. Now, maybe instead of telling stories, we're going to a horror movie, but that certainly is, I think, a long-standing part of Halloween. One of the things we should talk about is haunted attractions, because that has become in the 21st century such a gigantic part of Halloween, and that was not always the case. And the haunted attractions, a lot of people point to different origins for them. You can go all the way back to these ghost shows that were put on in the 18th century that were called phantasmagorias, where they would have a primitive slide projector and they would show ghosts on the slide projector, and sometimes they would even do these presentations in actual cemeteries, and they were like magic shows, and to me that is not the start of the haunted attraction. I kind of look at the 1930s as the real start of haunted attractions, because we can go back and see that people were setting these things up to buy these prank players off, and sometimes they got quite elaborate. They would take, for example, a local patch of wooded area and set up something called a trail of terror, where the kids would have to go through these dark woods on Halloween night, and they would have people stationed around the woods doing scary things and, jumping out at the kids. After the 30s, as we get into the 40s and 50s and 60s, we start to see these nonprofit groups taking on the idea of these haunted attractions being big profit earners for them. The JCs, which is the Junior Chamber of Commerce, was the first one to realize the tremendous financial possibilities of these, and they were putting these primitive haunted houses on all over the United States. And then the college age group Campus Life kind of took that and expanded it even more and got much more gory in the process. When I was a teenager, I went through a Campus Life haunted house in the 70s, and it was insanely gory. Even for a horror-loving kid like me, it was like, ooh. It was, and then of course, get the real start of the profit-earning haunted attractions with the amusement parks in the 80s. And places like Knott's Berry Farm and were looking at some way to take their lackluster fall profits and boost them. And they came up with the idea of doing these Halloween makeovers, and it was tremendously successful. And so that kind of really spawns the modern haunted attraction, which soon leaves the amusement parks, becomes standalone things all over the U.S. and is now spreading to other parts of the world as well, and becomes a gigantic industry in the process.
Yeah, we went to one last week. It was one that was, so it's at a farm in Pennsylvania. And I mean, at this point, those elements have become a permanent fixture. So, they're working on it year round just to open up around Halloween. And they have their cornfields, which they still maintain, and all their other crops. But it's like they work around the fact that they have haunted attractions at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting. That all falls into an area called agritainment. And what a lot of farmers have found out is that they can make a lot more money turning their fields to uses like that than just growing food.
Are there any similar holidays or celebrations that are similar to Halloween across the world?
I always love to talk about Dia de los Muertos in Mexico and a few other Latin American countries, but mainly Mexico. What is so interesting to me about Dia de los Muertos is it's what you get if you take the Celtic influence out of Halloween, because it has much the same backstory. You have these Catholic missionaries coming in to convert indigenous peoples in a part of the world that had never had Catholicism before. But you get this very different holiday when those missionaries are converting Mayans and Aztec peoples and taking their existing celebrations and adding them to their Saints' Day. And with Dia de los Muertos, All Saints' Day was only part of it because the Catholic Church had added a second celebration to All Saints' Day. They added an All Souls' Day on November 2nd. And the idea here was that a lot of members of the Catholic Church had complained about All Saints' Day, essentially saying, well, it's nice that we honor the saints, but what about our own loved ones who are dead? And so the idea with All Souls' Day was that you would be praying for your loved ones who were trapped in purgatory. So it definitely had a little bit of a macabre edge to it that All Saints' Day did. And that seems to be the sort of part of that the peoples in Mexico were responding to. And it was combining with these traditional Aztec holidays that had much more emphasis on bones in the imagery than the sort of ghost things that we get with the Celts. And so now we have Dia de los Muertos, which is this holiday in which you are both honoring your deceased loved ones, but mocking death. Death becomes something that is playful. So we see the candy skulls and things like La Catrina, the famous Posada etching that shows the woman who is a skull in a big flowery hat. And this marvelous artist Posada was saying, hey, death hits everyone the same way. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or male, female, you are all going to die and turn into this skull. And it's something that I think is a really wonderful holiday that is very distinct from Halloween. There are similar holidays, of course, throughout the world. There are a lot of different cultures that have holidays that celebrate their deceased loved ones. In Asia, we get things like the Festival of Hungry Ghosts or the Oban Festival. What's interesting to me about those Asian celebrations is that many people find them actually genuinely a little bit scary. And one of the things that has made Halloween a little bit more popular in, for example, China, is young people saying, well, I love these pumpkins and these funny looking skulls and ghosts and things because my own holiday is actually scary. This is just playful and fun and whimsical. And it's so interesting that Halloween is just caught on around the world, and that sort of element of playful imagery has been really huge in that.
Seems like nowadays adults love Halloween as much as kids do. So, what do you think happened?
There were a lot of interesting transitions that led to that. They kind of start in the 60s when trick or treat is gigantic, but we start to get these urban legends of people handing out tampered treats. The razor blade in the apple, which is a complete urban legend. And then in the 70s, there was a real crime story of a man named Ronald O'Brien who poisoned his son's pixie stick with arsenic. It was an insurance scam, but it found its way into the public consciousness as, oh, there are people out there, anonymous psychos, who are tampering with my kids' candy. And we start to get that thing in the 70s where people are telling their kids not to accept unwrapped candies, and they're taking the treats to hospitals to have them x-rayed, and it really kind of went nuts. And so that starts to transition Halloween away from a children's holiday. At the same time, there are other interesting things happening. In the 70s, there are a lot of interesting countercultural movements that are going on, and some of those are claiming Halloween as their own. LGBTQ plus celebrations are becoming gigantic on both sides of America. For example, in New York, we have the Greenwich Village Parade, which is drawing like 1 million spectators and has become a sort of wild revelry. And on the other side, in the 70s, there were humongous celebrations in San Francisco and West Hollywood. And another group that starts to sort of say, hey, this is our holiday, is pagan groups, which are on the rise in the 70s. And so these are starting to swing it into becoming an adult holiday. For me, what kind of completes the transition is the 1978 release of John Carpenter's Halloween. And I know it's hard to imagine a movie having that big an impact on a holiday, but I think in this case it did, because it made Halloween genuinely very, very frightening for the first time. There is nothing playful about Halloween. It's very much an adult exercise in terror. And it leads the way, of course, into the 80s slashers and horror movies. And the 80s is when we really see that transformation almost complete, especially with the rise of the haunted attractions and the amusement parks and so forth.
Yeah, I remember being a kid trick-or-treating. My mother is like, well, before you touch any candy, I have to look at all of it. And then she did that for maybe like a couple of years. And then she's like, I like, just look at it yourself. I really don't think there's anything. Because, you're not finding anything in the candy. And with, what is it? Robert Clark O'Brien.
Right, O'Brien, yeah.
And that, that's a scary moment that somebody would do that to their own kid, and was going to do it to other kids as well.
Plan was to try and cover it up by doing it to other kids. And it was a humongous story. It was in all of the newspapers at the time. The case was known as the Candyman. It was not just like a little regional Texas happening. It captivated the nation. I always loved the stories, and this is more modern, of people putting drugs. That was huge about 5-6 years ago, people passing out drugs to trick-or-treaters. And of course, that's one of those things that you hear and you just think, okay, what pothead is going to give free drugs out to kids on Halloween? It doesn't scan.
So, obviously we're talking about Halloween. There's an element to it, right, of people enjoying the idea of being scared, the fear element. Why do you think people enjoy that so much?
Of course, that's the same reason that we have horror movies and horror books and haunted attractions. And I think we all love to test our fears, to know that, for example, you recently went through a haunted attraction and you come out on the other end and you're like, hey, I made it. that was okay. I'm still here. And some people I know don't enjoy that, and that's fine. But I'm certainly one of those people who likes to have that little thrill where maybe your heart is beating faster, you feel more alive for a few seconds. It's a fun thing for me and for many people as well. And there have been actual like physiological studies done on this to show that it does trip certain chemicals to be produced in the brain that give us a little bit of a rush. And so I think it's interesting to me that Halloween has become more popular with adults because I think the world is getting more fearful all the time. And I think the idea of a holiday where we get to test that and put it into a sort of playful perspective is something that is becoming more valuable maybe as the world gets bigger and scarier.
I like haunted attractions. I like reading horror fiction. I like horror movies. But it's become apparent to me that out of my friends and family, I'm the most extreme. Because when we went, on our way to the haunted house, I was like, oh, Chandi, so you've been to like these before, right? And she's like, no, not really. I was like, wait, so this one, the worst one in the country, is supposed to be your first one that you go to. Great. But she enjoyed herself. But I think I enjoyed it in a completely different way, which I realized lately. I feel like I just want to like see my reaction as I go through, which I think everybody does that.
I'm kind of a little along those lines too, but part of it is because I have a long-standing secret desire to design a haunted house, and so
what really scares you? And it could be Halloween related or not.
I don't scare easily, but I do have one very personal, intense fear, which is developing dementia, because I have cared for two relatives, including my mom, who developed dementia later in life. And my mom had it for a long, long time, and it turned her into a completely different person. And so I sometimes feel like I am living with an expiration date. There is, of course, no sure knowledge that I will develop it. I could live a nice lucid life, and I hope that will be the case. But having cared, I was actually my mom's live-in caregiver for almost 3 years, and when you go through that with someone, I think it probably is going to be a fairly big chance that you're going to develop a fear of developing that yourself. And by the way, I should define that when we talk about dementia, I think a lot of people who have not been near anyone who had it think of it as just, oh, I forgot what I had for lunch. Where did I set my keys? I'm going to go for a walk in the street when I shouldn't. But it can also take the form of full-blown hallucinations. People with dementia can become very aggressive, sometimes no apparent reason. That was the case with my mom. So it was really hard to deal with. And that is probably my biggest fear, aside from election results at this point.
That's a fear.
It's scary. It's definitely scary.
It is. And it's scary to watch someone who is, because my mom and I were like best friends, and she was my hero, and she was amazing. And she was like that cool mom who all the other kids in the neighborhood wanted to come over to your house, just not because of you, but because of how fun your mom was,
Right.
And watching her personality just flip 180 degrees was just really awful. So,
Chandi, what are you afraid of?
Lots of things, actually. Pitch darkness. I mean, sometimes fear is also irrational, right? I'm really scared of, like, if it's like complete darkness.
I mean, I get how that can be scary. What are you afraid would happen in the darkness?
I actually don't know.
I think that fear of darkness is hardwired into us. I think that's one of the most basic fears, right up there with death, because when it's dark, if you think in terms of 50,000 years ago, being in total darkness might have meant that there was a woolly mammoth about to charge you or something. So it makes total sense that we're probably all a little uncomfortable, if not downright terrified in darkness.
So ever since I was a kid and I saw the China Syndrome, which I will never watch again, I'm definitely afraid of any sort of like nuclear disaster, which means like when the issue happened in Japan, I was no good for like a few days. That is probably the scariest thing because there's nothing you can do about it. Like, it's happened. So, like, anything dealing with like nuclear disasters is what I'm definitely afraid of.
No, I mean, I think maybe that's why, even if you're not into Halloween, I mean, that sense of fear, everybody has something, right?
So in this area, I don't know if New Jersey, people don't talk about it much, but there's a lot of colonial history built into it. You might walk past a house and did not realize it's from the 1600s. A lot of old cemeteries. We have a colonial cemetery not far. And so I was walking past a very old Presbyterian church cemetery. And it's right next to the train station. So you don't, it's normal. And there's people that get off and they also walk in the same direction as you. And it's as if somebody was really close behind me walking, but not like, it sounded like the shoes were like very old, like wooden soled shoes. I was like, well, maybe it's some lady in high heels walking behind. I don't know. And I didn't turn around because something was like, you don't need to turn around. Just keep looking straight. Just keep walking. And then I get to a street where I turn off of the main road, and most people don't walk as far as I do from the train station. So no one ever really turns that corner and walks behind me. And I was like, well, that's weird. Footsteps are still right behind me. So then there's a moment where I have to cross the street, and like that's when I'm going to turn around and look behind me. I step off the sidewalk. I'm almost in the middle of the street. I turn around and look. There's no one behind me, and the footsteps just stop. That was a rough one. Could not explain that. There was nobody behind me. Like, the person, if I turned around, they would have been right behind me. There's nobody there. And then there's another thing that happened in the same town on the main road at 2:00 in the morning after I got off of the train from a fishing trip, which is horse footsteps. And there is no horse behind me. You can hear a horse. There's no horse. Those are the scariest, like, fall-related things that have happened to me.
Those are excellent stories. Of course, the paranormal historian side of me is dying to know if you did any history looking into that cemetery.
I have not yet. The first thing I did was just kind of see how old. Well, the only thing I did was find out how old the oldest people buried there. Where it's 1700s. I think like maybe mid to late 1700s. Oddly enough, somebody that I don't speak to every day or really don't know all that well had been over the house not long after the horse footstep incident. And I didn't tell anybody, 100% serious. I told absolutely no one about the horse because I was like, maybe I'm just tired, right? It's 2 a.m. I just need to go to bed. So we're sitting in the basement, just talking, and his friend said something along the lines of, because everybody knows that Main Street is haunted. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because then I was like, oh, like, you need to explain this. She's like, well, have you never been on Main Street like super late at night and heard horse footsteps? And I was like, oh, well, yes. I just thought I was tired. I didn't think that was a real thing. But I believe in some things, but I'm also quite skeptical. So I'm not like at first just going to be like, oh, of course it's haunted. I'm like, no, that's just, I'm crazy. And yeah, so she told me about her experience. And I was like, wow, okay. So that's another person who's had a similar experience at a similar time at night. And yeah, I don't know. History in this town, I mean, there's probably a lot, but I haven't really had a chance to delve into the deep history of. I know that obviously there's like Revolutionary War history that everybody knows that, but besides that, I don't know anything specific. Lisa, is there anything else about Halloween that you would love to mention?
The only thing I love to talk about is how Halloween is expanding around the world. It has grown in popularity in the non-English speaking countries gigantically in just the last 20 years. I always talk about how my first Halloween book, which I think I did in 2002, was the Halloween Encyclopedia. And then 10 years later in 2012, I did a book called Trick or Treat: A History of Halloween. There is like almost no mention in the encyclopedia of it being outside of English-speaking countries. Just in that 10-year period from 2002 to 2012, it exploded in popularity in places I never expected to see it. And it is now celebrated in nearly every part of the world that is in the Northern Hemisphere. We don't see a lot yet in the Southern Hemisphere, and I think because the seasonal association is lost there. They don't get the fall and the harvest and all that is a really big part of Halloween, even still in the 21st century. But it is catching on even in places now like Australia and South Africa and so forth. And one of the interesting things that I love to watch as it moves into these countries where it is just kind of starting to get established is how it's meshing with existing cultural traditions. And my favorite thing to point to on that is in Hong Kong, there is a very popular amusement park called Ocean Park. And Ocean Park has been celebrating Halloween for quite a while, for a few decades, I think. But about maybe it was 6, 7 years ago, they did a Halloween haunted attraction that took visitors through the levels of Buddhist hell. And that is so fascinating to me that they are combining this Western holiday with their own Eastern traditions. I've always predicted that we would see that happen more and more with Halloween. So it's kind of exciting to me whenever we do see it happening. And I think it's something that's going to happen more and more.
That's amazing. I would have loved to have experienced that.
Wonder how many levels they have.
There are a lot. They explored them pretty well. They also, I think, did one maze that was based on local ghost legends around Hong Kong. And like I said, I love seeing that combination of existing cultural things with this import.
Yeah, it's like a really cool fusion because you get the context. It's also appealing to locals, right? Because it's not like a completely foreign tradition. It's part of their own, but also adding a little bit of spice to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
And we know Halloween is here to stay, so that's pretty cool.
We'll all make sure of that.
It seems to keep surviving. After 9/11, there were a lot of people who predicted that Halloween would die off because in the wake of something like a terrible terrorist act, they thought, it would, instead, Halloween was bigger than ever that year. The same thing happened with COVID. During COVID in 2020, people were like, this is it for Halloween. It came back stronger than ever in 2021, and I don't see it going anywhere bad anytime soon.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, so much. This is great. We really enjoyed learning a lot more about Halloween, dispelling myths.
Thanks for inviting me, and enjoyed chatting as well.
As we close out this Halloween episode, a huge thank you to Lisa for joining us and sharing her incredible knowledge and chilling tales about the history and magic of Halloween.
If you're curious to learn more about Lisa Morton and her amazing work, be sure to check out her books like Calling the Spirits, A History of Seances, Trick or Treat, A History of Halloween, and more. You can also visit her website at lisamorton.com, where she shares her deep dives into Halloween history, horror writing tips, and much more. That's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. Check out Minisode 7, Field of Screams. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, X, Instagram, and Threads. Thanks for joining us for this Halloween special. Stay spooky, stay safe, and we'll catch you next time.
Until next time.